Right.
Yeah.
And then there's everything to unpack in Montana in the speech last night, including this as President Trump pulled out an old favorite talking about Senator Elizabeth Warren. Let's watch.
Let's say I'm debating Pocahontas, right? I promise you I'll do this. I will take, you know those little kits they sell on television for $2? Learn your heritage. And in the middle of the debate, when she proclaims that she's of Indian heritage, because her mother said she has high cheekbones, we will take that little kit and say, but we have to do it gently. Because we're in the Me Too generation, so we have to be very gentle. And we will very gently take that kit and we will slowly toss it, hoping it doesn't hit her and injure her arm, even though it only weighs probably 2 ounces. And we will say, I will give you $1 million to your favorite charity, paid for by Trump, if you take the test and it shows you're an Indian, you know. And let's see what she does, right?
So, Gene, not surprising that he pulled out the Pocahontas routine. He does that whenever he gets the chance to do it. But what struck a lot of us and a lot of other people was the sort of flippant reference to the Me Too movement, which had no relationship to what he was talking about exactly, but he found a way to get it in. This from a man, of course, who's been accused in the era of Me Too time and time again.
Yeah, Me Too had nothing to do with anything he was talking about. It's an interesting tell, right? Because Donald Trump sort of slips in references to what's worrying him or what he's thinking about and doesn't want to talk about, but he talks about it anyhow. So somehow, I guess that's on his mind these days. Maybe another porn star is going to come out or something like that, and he knows about it and doesn't want to talk about it. Sometimes you watch a performance like last night, and you almost think, gee, is this some sort of weird Andy Kaufman kind of performance art thing that he's doing? Is this really happening? Is this the President of the United States?
It is.
Alas, the answer is yes, it is the President of the United States. And as you mentioned, he has now gotten us into a ridiculous and probably ultimately disastrous trade war with China. There's no reason for this. He's going about it, even if he wants to get tough on China, he's going about it in precisely the wrong way. He's going to cost thousands and thousands of U.S. jobs. He's going to raise prices for U.S. consumers. It's just ridiculous, and it's all to feed his wrong preconceived notions and his ego.
Well, you know, Mika, while we're talking about child separation policy, Judy Woodruff is reporting that a 14-month-old boy was separated from his immigrant parents at the border and was returned after 85 days, had lice all over him, had not been bathed, from what they can tell. And Lisa News is going to be reporting on that, the NewsHour.
Is that 14 months?
I'm sorry.
Wow.
14-month-old. Did I say 14-year-old?
No, you did. I was just underlining that.
14-month-old boy separated from his parents, returned after 85 days. Well, my son is not the same since we reunited. I thought that because he's so young, he wouldn't be traumatized by this experience. But he does not separate from me. He cries when he does not see me. That behavior is not normal. In El Salvador, he would stay with his dad or his sister and not cry. Now he cries for fear of being alone. A boy not bathed, held in United States custody for 85 days, separated from his mother. This NewsHour report had lice all over him when he was returned. Was not bathed for 85 days. And this is Donald Trump's policy.
And it's a policy that is echoed in the airwaves of Fox News, described by one host as summer camp-like conditions.
Summer camp.
Described by the Secretary of Homeland Security as just a policy that if you break the law, you break the law. Not really understanding the different dynamics between people seeking asylum.
You know, by the way,
also saying that.
By the way, though, Mika, think about this for a second. If El Salvador seized a 14-month-old American baby,
That would be considered a hostage.
kept that 14-month-old boy away from his parents for 85 days and was returned in this condition, make no mistake of it, we would not file a protest. We would be sending troops down there. If Russia did this, if Turkey did this, if the Philippines did this, if any country on the planet did this, we would go to the floor of the United Nations and rightly condemn those actions. This is American policy under Donald Trump.
And
Republicans are doing nothing to find those children. I want to know, because a couple weeks ago, I'd said the Red Cross was not allowed to go in. The Red Cross wrote me back, that's not true. We never said that, even though they had said that in a previous tweet. I wonder, Gene, have you heard any news? Has the Red Cross been able to go into any of these facilities and check the well-being of the children? Because if they have, I would like to ask the American Red Cross, how did you let a child have lice?
Really?
And not be bathed for 85 days, because the American Cross made a big deal of tweeting back at me, well, this is not true. We have not been barred from going in to visit.
Well, go in.
What is the status? Because the American Red Cross said they were available to help. They
Sounds
told
like a
the Trump
crisis.
administration they were available to help, but the American Red Cross said we can only go in and help if they will let us.
Yeah.
Have they let them? Have they let any relief organizations go in?
I don't know. That would be a good phone call to make today to try to find out, because if I'm not aware that the Red Cross has had access, and I'm certainly not aware of anything the Red Cross has said to describe the conditions under which these children are being held. So let's find out.
Like Gene, isn't this why we have an American Red Cross? Like, if they have been allowed in, shouldn't they be reporting to us every day, since people give so much money to the American Red Cross? What's the American Red Cross doing? What do the children look like? Where are the children? We certainly find out during war. We know where our prisoners of war, because the Red Cross can go in.
They're being detained.
Right. But we don't know where the children are. We don't know where all the children are. It's just it's astounding. This is not the way you treat human beings. This is the way you treat animals, basically. This is the way you treat people who are subhuman, and again, this is what Donald Trump has done. He has sort of dehumanized these immigrants, particularly these brown-skinned immigrants from Latin America, who he doesn't want in the country, and he's made them a sort of a focal point of his racism, and this appalling mistreatment to treat a 14-month-old
This
child
is the
like
president's
that.
policy.
It just is infuriating.
It's infuriating, but it is the president's policy announced by the Attorney General in late March. The Attorney General then went back on his own words, which we can see on tape. He announces it. He says, you will be separated from your children.
It's all
And
on tape.
then he says, we didn't mean for them to really be separated. He pulls an Ivanka. And he says, we didn't mean for them to really be separated. And then he pulls back again. But it is the president's policy. You have the Secretary of Homeland Security who's saying it's not to send a message, but then she hopes that they get the message. And she does not know where the kids are. She doesn't know where the girls are being kept separately. She said she would get back to us. Has she gotten back to us? And then, as I mentioned, Ivanka Trump, who was mum on this policy, even though she's supposed to be fighting for women and families and for mothers. And then she finally tweets, thank you to the president. As twisted as the Attorney General, the president's people are all twisting the truth. And thanks the president for pulling back on a policy that has left 2,000 children's lives hanging in the balance.
Wait, listen, aren't we up to 3,000 now?
There are HHS updated to 3,000.
So now we're
just under 3,000.
And
now
again,
we're just under 3,000, and 100. What is it, Alex? 100 kids under the age of 5. My question is, and it's something we suggested at the time, Ivanka Trump should have said, I'm going to be in charge of leading a task force to find those children and reunite them with their family.
You bring up a really good point.
Now, 3,000 separated migrant kids, they don't know where their parents are. And the ones that are coming back, one had, you know, a 14-month-old has
Ivanka is thanking
lice.
the president for this situation, and Melania Trump took 2 trips to the border to ask the questions. How are these children doing? How are they being reunited? Are her statements as hollow as everybody else in the administration, or are there answers to those questions? Where are the children? Where are the babies? How are they doing? And how exactly will you reunite every single one with their families? Michael Warren, conservatives, Republicans on Capitol Hill, can they not find the words to ask these questions?
Maybe behind the scenes, and they ought to be doing it more publicly. But look, I mean, let's be sort of honest about what the truth is here, which is that there's not an easy answer. Certainly not what the Trump administration has done is the answer, but you do have the issue that these families are crossing the border illegally. This is a persistent problem. I don't think it's as big and as widespread as the president claims. But I think it requires some sort of serious policy analysis. What do you actually do? Do you have to reform the way that, people are talking about abolishing ICE? I think that's ludicrous.
Right.
But do you have to reform the way that all these processes happen when you have someone cross the border illegally who is apprehended, who has a family, who has children,
right.
And claims asylum? There's not an easy answer there. It doesn't seem like anybody is really trying to think through that and come up with a solution that actually does maintain the borders while not doing this horrific family separation policy.
It is horrific, and Michael, again, I'll say it again, as somebody who's pretty conservative on immigration policies, and who actually believes that Europe, because they don't have a middle ground on immigration policies in the EU, that's what's fueling the rise of the right, and been saying it for some time. It's irresponsible and reckless, their immigration policies, and it has been for years. That said, when Ted Cruz rightly says we need to get more judges down to the border so we can process these claims more quickly to end the separation of parents and their children, Donald Trump says no. Not only do we not want more judges down there, we don't want any judges down there.
Well, he also misrepresents too. He says the plan is the thousands and thousands of judges, which is not the plan. That's not what Cruz proposed. So I think there's a thing here. Mika, you asked about Republicans. Republicans, I think, are trying to figure out a way to work through this. But you do have the president at the top who is sort of insistent that he ignores some of those solutions. I don't know what the solution, the best solution here is, but you do need somebody at the top, the chief executive, and you need people surrounding him. I mean, we talked about John Kelly, the chief of staff. John Kelly is very much a restrictionist on immigration, and I think a lot of that, he doesn't have a lot of people around him, the president that is, who are able to say, look, you really need to reconsider this policy. It's not just Stephen Miller and John Kelly who ought to be advising.
Well,
him.
I believe, didn't Kristen Nielsen work for John Kelly?
Yes.
Do I have that wrong?
No, you're right.
She did.
She worked for him for quite a while. Okay.
Michael, my concern is, and I'm wondering if it's your concern, I don't know if you're as conservative as I am on immigration policy, but I believe the first thing you do as an American, if you cross the border, shouldn't be illegal. You should come here the way people from Pakistan, the way people from Sweden, the way people from Peru, from all across the world come to the United States of America. That said, isn't there a fear inside the conservative movement that there is a backlash to this, and this helps elect people who are actually very liberal on immigration policy, and we will see a massive swing in this area? Because this seems to undercut people like myself who are conservative on immigration policy. You can't even have that debate anymore without being smeared by Donald Trump's racist rhetoric and also this inhumane policy towards children.
Yeah, but I think that this cuts the other way as well. You know, I do think that push to abolish ICE, for instance, which is sort of mindless. There may be some very good ways to reform it. I don't know. I don't know enough about the way that DHS and DOJ and HHS all work together, and maybe they can work together better. But I think that the fact that the president sort of lowered the bar here on what is acceptable and was able to say, look, I changed the policy, even though, as we know from reporting, that that hasn't resolved the problem of family separation. He can claim he's changed the policy. He's able to say, and I think with some justification, that the left wing in the country on immigration has gone really far to the left to abolish ICE, he's really going to make the point going into these midterms that if you elect Democrats, he said this on Twitter, this is an open borders pro MS-13 party. That's what he says.
Yeah, but at the same time, as you know, even Chuck Schumer came out saying abolishing ICE was a stupid thing to do.
He did.
And the numbers on MS-13 are 0.013% of 330,000 illegal immigrants that come here. There's only 25 that are MS-13.
Look, I agree with you, Joe. I think the issue here, though, is, I mean, you mentioned Chuck Schumer. You could say Nancy Pelosi as well. Well, Nancy Pelosi was just handed a defeat last week in that Bronx and Queens district by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who ran in part on the idea of abolishing ICE and beat the Democratic establishment candidate. So it does seem to me, at least if you're an American watching these things and you're sort of on the fence, you're a little more like you, Joe, on immigration, but you don't like seeing this policy from the Trump administration. You hear something like abolish ICE, and you think, well, that seems a little extreme.
Yeah,
so we have two parties
I'm
going
just
in the
hoping
extreme.
that the children get reunited with their families. That's all that's all I'm shooting for here is the fact that these kids have been separated from their families under Trump's policy because of Trump's policy. And yes, there is the other and equally as debatable truth that there are lots of different problems with our immigration system that need to be addressed. I'm not avoiding that. I'm looking, though, at the problem created by this president and his flunkies who twist the truth around him that have left 2,000 children hanging in the balance. That's not the way America does business.
Not to correct you, but I think we're up to 3,000. And you're exactly right. And it would be in Republicans' best interest to do everything they can around the clock to get these parents and these children together. I know, Michael, you agree with it. A lot of other conservatives agree with that. And then roll up their sleeves and start answering the hard questions of what do we do to discourage parents from bringing children to the border without treating them the way we have over the past several months. Michael, thanks for being with us. We really appreciate it. Hope you have a great weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Susan and Jean, stay with us if you can. We want to ask you about the president's comments about our NATO allies. And also, he's told us, we had nothing to worry about with Kim Jong-un and nuclear weapons. He said, fine. Don't worry about that anymore. He said the same thing about Vladimir Putin last night. We'll talk about that. Also, at Morning Joe, President Trump openly questions the Points of Light Foundation and the concept of volunteering on behalf of those who have less, mocking George H.W. Bush, a guy who was shot down about 700 miles south of Japan in World War II. Also, he mocked John McCain last night. But since he seems so confused about
1,000 points of light,
1,000 points of light, we'll help explain it using President George H.W. Bush's own words. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.